Oh, hello, lovely to see you all. Well done for making it here through flooding and train and bus cancellations and incidents and delays and all sorts. Good job. Lisa's introduced me, so I don't really need to introduce myself, but this is me, independent researcher. I've never been an academic. I've never wanted to be an academic, but I'm quite happy doing scholarly work from my office in my garden. And I am an honorary research fellow here as of very recently, and thanks to Lisa. Yes, thumbs up all round. So that's great. So I'm on Eddie Rome today. Whoa, it's so good. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to be talking about, the story of creative research is what I've been asked to talk to you about today. And this is quite a long story. Part of my argument today is that really creative research is research. Research is a creative process. Whatever kind of research you do, it is creative. You're creating something that wasn't there before. You're finding out things that people didn't know before. Even if what you're finding out is that your experiment doesn't work, or that you should have asked some other questions when you did those interviews, that's still new and useful information that you can take forward and act on. So the question of where research began, did it begin where the world began? Did it begin where... There's evidence that animals do research too, not just people. There's evidence that crows and elephants and sea otters, who I loved really a lot till I discovered they're actually a big weasel, they all do research. They all try things out. They test things before making decisions. They'll try different operations, they'll try different tools, they'll try different techniques. And that's a form of research, trying different things to see which one you want to do. But people too, so maybe the first animal that came out of the primeval swamp that tried out a bit of walking on land to see what that would feel like and whether it was a good idea, maybe that was where research began. Or maybe it was with the first people who tried things out, tried using tools, all of that. Research has been around for a very long time. It's not new. It's a really, really old... It's a natural human activity, actually, and clearly a natural animal activity, at least for some species. So let's look at what we understand as the history of research methods more recently, the research methods that we teach in our universities, the research methods that we learn, the research methods we discuss with each other. This is really Euro-Western research methods history. I will come to Indigenous research methods a bit later. So we are in a paradigm here, but within the paradigm that Manchester University exists within, let's talk about the history of research methods. I don't know how accurate this is, but the received wisdom is that the first systematic clinical trial was done in 1747 by James Lind. Anyone know about this? A guy who was in the Navy. He was a naval medical officer, and he was concerned with the problem of scurvy, a disease which was, it was a killer disease, actually, for people on long voyages. I say people, they were pretty much all men, so there was a gender element to this too. And he was a bit bothered that so many seamen were dying or becoming incurably disabled as a result of this disease called scurvy. And he did a clinical trial. He divided the men on a ship into 6 groups. And he gave each group a different treatment. And these included vinegar, seawater, a purgative mixture, diluted sulfuric acid, pretty creative, I think you'll agree, cider, and lemons and limes. And it'll be no surprise to you, I think, that the lemons and limes group did by far the best. It's also slightly entertaining to discover that the second best group were the cider drinkers. So, let's hear it for cider. That's the first recorded, anyway, systematic clinical trial. That's 250 years ago or so, a bit over. It's not that long in terms of human history. Then the next notable invention was the questionnaire, which is less than 200 years old. This was devised by the Statistical Society of London, which had been founded in 1834. Those partisan people among you may like to know that the Statistical Society of Manchester was founded a year earlier in 1833 and claims to have invented the house-to-house survey. So there's a little rivalry there, but people are pretty definite about the question. I think there are records that show questionnaire invented. So, in 1838, the questionnaire was an enormously creative method. It was like, whoa, this thing we can do. Let's do this fun thing with boxes and ticks and Likert scales and all of that stuff. There's a question here about the relationship between innovation and creativity. That which is innovative is not necessarily particularly creative. That which is creative may not be particularly innovative. It might be putting together existing elements in a new way. But I'm not going to talk about that at great length because this is more interesting. Interviews, there's no clear record of when interviews were first used for research, but sometime in the early 20th century, researchers basically pinched the idea from journalists that a good way of getting information out of people was to ask them questions and listen to the answers and record them and then do something systematic with them. And then in World War II, focus groups were first used, as far as I can find out, to look at people's responses to propaganda in that war context. So that's a few dates. We don't think of these methods now as creative, do we really? We think of them as conventional. In some contexts, some of them are kind of almost reified. Questionnaires, interviews, and focus groups are like the big three when you're talking about social research. But actually, there's still scope for a lot of creativity. If you've ever tried to create a questionnaire, you'll know that you have to be pretty creative to create a good questionnaire, and you have to test it and then revise it and all of that stuff. So when I talk about creative research methods, I'm not so much talking about these guys, but I'm not talking about substituting other methods for them either. I'm talking about widening the toolbox. And another thing I think is really important to say is that using what we now think of as more creative research methods doesn't change good practice in research. It doesn't change the need to design your research carefully, to think it through, to be ethical, to use the best methods for answering your research question, not the method you happen to be in love with this week. So, moving swiftly on, what's happened since the 1940s? A huge amount. I wrote the book I wrote it in 2014, really. It came out in 2015, early 2015. So much has happened since then. It's really, huge expansion. And I'm sure you're all part of that movement. Everyone here is involved with and part of that movement. So before the 1960s, really research was the province of white, able-bodied men. It was a very sort of patriarchal, I could quote you some figures if I could remember them, and dates and things, but it was very much, there's documents around that always speak of the researcher as he, always the male pronoun used in the context of researchers for the first half of the 20th century, certainly. I would say, right up to the 1960s. Things started to change in the 60s for all sorts of reasons, and now the people who do research and the ways in which research is done are much more diverse. The able-bodied white men were really all about positivism and about clinical trials and questionnaires. Maybe questionnaires were seen as a bit fringe, really. And then, from the 1960s, it's just and it's still proliferating. It's huge, it's growing, it's moving. Let's look at some of the details of what happened. So in the 1970s, with really the initial big wave of feminism starting to take off, there was research in the UK, research in the US. So in the UK, people like these women, who are some of my heroes, starting to research topics that were particularly of interest to women and that clearly weren't being researched by men, such as family issues, housework, motherhood, lesbian experiences of homophobia. These kinds of things were some of the topics that these women were saying were worthy of research, while men were telling them they weren't. But I think we won that one. And simultaneously in the US, Laurel Richardson, who's, if anything, an even bigger hero of mine, she was doing research on things like people opening doors for each other. What was the impact of gender on this normal, everyday activity? Not much surprise to us to find that she discovered that men mostly open doors for women, but then she unpacked the implications of that, wrote journal articles which were rejected because she was told she was too strident. They were only of interest to women, so what was the point of them being published in an academic journal? It's nice to look back sometimes and reflect we have come quite a long way, even if there is still a fair amount of work to do. The key central points of all of this were to challenge some of the pillars on which the positivist research movement was built, like the researcher should be objective and stand away from the topic being researched and not influence it, just observe, because observing does not influence anything. Only it does, we know that now. And the researcher should be neutral, should not take a view, should just leave all their biases on the coat hook at the door. which also we now know is not possible. But it was these women, these pioneering women, who began to really challenge this and pave the way for the work that all of us can do today. But it wasn't just the women, and it wasn't just the feminists. Oh, sorry, forgot that bit. The other important part about this is it puts identity centre stage and acknowledges the importance of the context in which the research is being done, rather than trying to pretend it exists in some kind of isolated bubble, which clearly, if it's real-world research, it doesn't. So that's another aspect to the feminist research. Feminist research, of course, is itself activist research, but there were other forms of activist research going on. And these were, you know, the feminist research, the activist researchers were all being pretty creative in just breaking out of the stereotypes, but also they used some interestingly creative methods. So I don't know if anyone's come across Paul Hunt. He was a person with physical disabilities. He had a background in research and activism. And he found himself in a position where he had to live in a Leonard Cheshire home for people with disabilities as a fairly young adult. At that time, the homes were more like warehousing for people, really, rather than what I hope would be more likely to happen now, although there are still question marks about that. And the residents of the home that Paul Hunt was in began to argue with the management of the home to say that they wanted more autonomy, they wanted to be treated more like adults, less of a paternalistic model. And the staff said, no, we know what's best for you because you've got disabilities, therefore you can't really think, and so we'll decide. And in the end, this argument continued, and in the end, the staff said, okay, we'll bring in some independent researchers that aren't on our side and aren't on your side to investigate this properly, talk to you, talk to us, come to a conclusion. And the people who lived in the home said, okay, that sounds like a good plan. So the independent researchers came in, talked to everybody, drew conclusions that the staff were right and that the people with disabilities didn't really have brains that worked and couldn't really be allowed to make their own decisions. So Paul Hunt decided that never again would he have anything to do with any research as a participant unless he was conducting that research himself. And that started a movement which was taken forward by people like Mike Oliver and a whole bunch of people to what we know more today, which I'll come to in a minute. But it wasn't just people with physical disabilities, also people with mental health problems were coming onto this same track from a different starting point. Diana Rose, again, some of you may know her work. She's a person with mental health problems and a researcher, and she did some very pioneering work around the turn of the century to do with electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, which is a quite invasive treatment for people with some sorts of mental health problems. It's supposed to cause improvements. What it actually tends to do is cause things like memory loss and personality change, the kind of side effects nobody wants. And clinicians thought that people were really happy with their treatment because all the feedback forms that they gave to people after treatment were very positive. But what Diana Rose found was that people were writing very different accounts on blogs and elsewhere online in forums. And so she collected a bunch of these accounts and compared them with the feedback on feedback forms and concluded that people were giving positive reports immediately after treatment because they never ever wanted to have it again, not because it had been marvellous. And her research, actually changed policy and practice here in the UK. It was presented to the Royal College of Physicians, psychiatrists, beg your pardon, and they changed their policies, and ECT is now used differently in the UK as a result of her research. That's just one example. I'm just picking out, tiny examples here. There are many, many more that I could have chosen. And what this has led to is a common phrase you might have heard, the nothing about us without us, which is now used by researchers with learning disabilities, researchers with, all across the spectrum of what are known as service users who want to do their own research and not have it done to them or done on them or even done about them. They want to be involved. There are some ethical considerations here. It's clearly an ethical step in the right direction, but there are also problems. Some so-called user-led research is now being used quite tokenistically, I think, here in the UK, in the National Health Service. There's a programme called Patient and Public Involvement, or PPI, where patients, even carers, and the public are supposed to be involved in all sorts of things, but the nature and the quality of that involvement is, in some cases, extremely questionable. Not necessarily in all. I think in some places are trying to do it well, but with resources as they are, and this is the kind of research that needs pretty solid resourcing, that's problematic. And also, there's the question of where you draw the line between research and activism, or the relationship between research and activism, can be a troubled one. Because if you're an activist because you're really passionate about something, whether you're an environmental activist, or a religious activist, or a human rights activist, whatever it is, you do that because you really care about it. And if you then want to do research, you need to acknowledge and separate the differences between your activist work and your research work, not in a sort of you can be a neutral, objective researcher kind of way, because clearly you can't, even if you're not an activist. But to acknowledge where your biases are so that people who read and use your research can take that into account. If you're interested in the relationship between research and activism, there's a terrific book by Alice Drager, American activist researcher, called Galileo's Middle Finger. Very readable. It's about intersex research. I won't tell you all the details because I'll run out of time, but I'd recommend it if you're interested in this particular issue. So, that's a bit of the story of how we got to a point where we could be more creative with our research methods. And I'm now going to talk a little bit about how that manifests now, or certainly over the last 10, 20 years, a bit longer in some cases. When I wrote the book, I identified kind of pillars, if you like, of creative research: arts-based research, research using technology, mixed methods research, and the transformative research frameworks such as feminist and activist research that I was just speaking about. I would now add embodied research to that mix, because in the last few years there's been a load of stuff done and published about embodied research. It didn't only start a few years ago, but that's one of the areas that's really massively growing. Arts-based research, people sometimes think creative research and arts-based research are one and the same, which they're not entirely. Arts-based research is an important subset of creative research methods, but it's not the whole of the thing. And within the arts, too, people sometimes think it's just the visual arts, which, again, it's not. They're important, but they're not the whole of the thing. It's also poetry, prose, fiction, stories, so the text arts, three-dimensional arts, modelling, sculpture, pottery, collage, all that kind of stuff, theatre, performative arts, music, theatre, song, dance, interpretive dance. We'll be doing that later. You'll like that, won't you? If you haven't come across Dance Your PhD, anyone know about Dance Your PhD? Yes? If you don't know about it, go look on YouTube. Seriously, it's great. And I also love that some universities are now doing Bake Your PhD. I think that started in Southampton, and Bath picked it up last year, and they very clearly said that entries had to make research accessible to the public through the medium of baking, which is, a bit of a spin-off from Bake Off, but nevertheless kind of awesome, and a bit more accessible for some people than dance, although not for all. So embodied research, people are saying, they're kind of two, as far as I can tell from reading, there are sort of two schools of thought around embodied research at the moment, one of which is saying you can take embodiment into account in research and that can be interesting, and the other saying you can't do disembodied research because we all live in our bodies. And I kind of think both are true, maybe. I'm not sure. I haven't figured that out yet. I don't think there's any consensus. But embodied research, embodiment, the way embodied people are thinking about sensory input, about using senses in data, not just the big main 5 senses either, but kinesthetic and proprioception, all that stuff. There's some really fascinating work going on around embodied research right now. Loads of scope for using technology in research in all sorts of ways. You can make an app. Well, you might not be able to, I don't think I could, but in theory, an app can be made by a researcher to do research. We'll be hearing a lot from Luca next. I'm the warm-up act here, really, about digital humanities and mapping and GIS. We all use tech in our working lives anyway, pretty much, I think. I mean, I see laptops around here, I see smartphones, I see tablets. All of this is going on, is happening right now. And then mixing methods. There's some really creative work going on around mixing methods. And one of the things that interests me about that, initially, there was quantitative research over here and qualitative research over there, and they were far, far apart. And then it must be the case that one day somebody from one or the other said, wonder what they're doing. Shall we go and have a look and see if it's interesting? And then they developed a thing called mixed methods, which was purely about collecting both quantitative and qualitative data. For a while, that was what mixed methods research was. But it's opened out a whole lot now. So you can actually mix methods at pretty much any stage of the research process, which doesn't mean you have to, but you can collect data one way and analyze it 3 ways. Or you can collect data one way, analyze it one way, and then disseminate it 6 ways. And there's still a mixed methods aspect to the work that you do. And of course, these are not mutually exclusive, these categories. You can do feminist embodied research using technology if you want to. But they're useful ways to help us think about it, useful ways to conceptualize what's quite a big and complex field of research methods. Good, I haven't run out of time yet. So here are just some of the examples of things people use. People use artifacts, and also people are creative with the more conventional methods. So, for example, enhanced interviewing is a thing. So instead of just doing an interview where you sit sort of knee to knee and do that with someone and ask them lots of questions, people are making art with the people they're doing interviews with. They might be bringing in artifacts and saying, can you pick one that represents how you feel, or can you arrange these in a way that represents your situation, your family, your department, whatever it is they're researching. People are using photos. That's quite a well-known one, photo elicitation in interviews. But there's all sorts of ways you can enhance the interviewing experience and take the focus off this weird interpersonal thing. Walking interviews, I should be mentioning at this point. Lots of different ways to do that. To take a very conventional method and give it a creative twist. So it doesn't have to be full-on interpretive dance, going straight on YouTube. It can be something a little more gentle. If you want to be a bit more creative with your research, think what's that next step you could take? You don't have to go all out and make it up. You can just, what's the next thing? Useful question to ask yourself sometimes. So it's also about thinking, what is it you can do that we don't call research, but that might be useful in a research context sometimes? And when I'm reading about creative research, I see this over and over again, that someone is using their martial arts skills to enhance their research work, or their ice skating skills, or their tree surgery skills, or, there's all sorts of stuff that people can do that may, at times, have a bearing or a usefulness on a research project. It used to be that research skills were separate. This is part of the positivist hangover, I suppose. Research skills are a separate lot of skills that we only use when we're doing research and we never use any other time. Although actually, I use my research skills in my life too. Like if I want to choose something, if I want to choose a purchase, or I want to evaluate an experience, or, I will draw on my research skills for that. These things are not, the boundaries between these things are not impermeable. So let's acknowledge that we can bring our existing skills. If you're good at poetry, or you're good at music, or you're good at tech, or you're just good at thinking about stuff, there's all sorts of ways this can happen. But again here, with creative methods, there are ethical things to think about. So I think I said earlier that it's really important to use the method that is going to help you answer your research question, not the method you like best. Even if you are really good at poetry, it's only worth using poetry if it's actually appropriate, if poetic inquiry is appropriate for the research work that you're doing. And also, there's a kind of, with some creative methods, there's a kind of feeling, I get this with participatory research a lot. When I read about participatory research, people are very uncritical about it. Often people who write, there's a book about this thick by a couple of really committed French Canadians, I think, excuse me. And it's all about participatory research, and it's a really good book. There's a lot to learn from it, but there's not a word of critique. And yet, I think the question, how participatory is participatory research, is a really important one to ask. In that book, there's a very good index, big tick from me, lots of names in the index. If someone's cited in the text, their name will be in the index. And yet participants are given titles in the text to anonymize them. They're called things like the cook or the forestry officer, but those don't appear in the index. So how participatory is that? That raises a big question mark for me. And I think, I'm not saying participatory research is bad. I mean, I guess that was just a kind of oversight, probably by the indexer, not even the writers, but the fact that there's no critique at all bothers me, because no method solves all our problems. No method or no approach is going to make everything right and everything work in the world, or all research function. We need to be able to draw on a diversity of approaches, a diversity of theories, a diversity of methods to suit the context of the research that we're trying to do, to suit the question, the time, the problem, the location, to suit all of these things. And I think that's an ethical issue as much as anything else. How am I doing? Now, this is important. Right, so up to now, I've been talking about Euro-Western research. This is very much of its time and place also. This is research from what we might call the Western world or the global north, primarily. Not completely, but primarily. And there's some hugely creative work being done by Indigenous researchers. Indigenous here is a word I'm using to denote colonized people in settled colonized countries, because it's not a fixed term, so it's important to clarify that. And Indigenous research has actually been around, it predates Euro-Western research by tens of thousands of years. It's not just something, sometimes people think, oh bless, they've picked up some tips from us as we colonized them and did genocide and stuff. It's not like that. It's a very full and rich paradigm that stands on its own. And it can be traced back, I think, so by people in Papua New Guinea, they trace it back around 45 to 48,000 years through their oral history. In Alaska, it's traced back through 7 ice ages, but that's the equivalent period of time. So it's measured differently in different places, but around the world, there's clarity that these methods have been around. And it's all been, all the wisdom is through oral history, but people are starting to write now. Indigenous scholars are starting to write about their methods, about their ethics. There's only a certain extent to which you can write about Indigenous methods because they really have got the context thing, identity central thing down. It's all about relationships. Relationships matter more than research to Indigenous peoples. I think we could possibly learn some things here. I'm not an expert in this. If you want an expert in this, you need to find an Indigenous researcher. I'm a student of this literature. But I find it absolutely fascinating, particularly on the ethics side, more than the methods, because methods are very dependent. But there are some texts. I mean, Begele Chilisa, if you want to know about the methods themselves, I would recommend her book, which is about the 4th one down, Indigenous Research Methodologies. She's an Indigenous researcher from Botswana in Africa. So the literature is beginning to grow, and in journal articles too, some of the journals, like Norman Denzin's journal Qualitative Inquiry, is very open to publishing work by Indigenous researchers, and others are beginning to follow suit, which is helpful. It's very much a holistic approach. Almost all, as far as I can understand it, almost all Indigenous researchers are insider researchers, are in their community doing research with their community, for their community. So the whole issue of neutrality and objectivity is a joke, really. And there is space for external research in that sometimes a community might ask someone to come in from outside, from another community, to come and help them solve a problem. But mostly it's insider research. The relationships with participants predate the research, will follow the research, and so are more important than the research. The research serves relationships, not the other way around. Here we cultivate relationships to serve our research purposes. In Indigenous research, it's diametrically opposite. It's highly ethical. There's a very clear system of ethics based on relationality, accountability, mutual benefit. Participants need to benefit as much as researchers, and so on. And decolonizing methods came out of this. They're not the same as Indigenous research. They came out of this in that Indigenous peoples too started to say, hang on, if research is going to be done about us, we're going to do it. And that grew. Certainly Linda Smith's book, Decolonizing Methodologies, which came out in '99, and which opened my eyes to this when I was doing my master's 20 years ago. It's now in a new edition. I'd get the 2012 edition if you want to read it, but it's really, really interesting on all of this. I've said relationship-based and highly creative. It's just absolutely, every research project is created to fit the time, to fit the place, using whatever's available. As I understand it, there aren't reified methods in the way that we've ended up reifying some of the methods that have been handed down to us.
Well, thank you, Helen. That's really
Oh, thank you.